After 2 long years, finally, all the hostages are back home. 20 living hostages who had the most horrific experience at the hands of the Hamas terror organization in Gaza are finally back with their families across Israel. There is celebration, but what will be the future of Gaza? What will be the future of this Middle East conflict? One person who has been from day one on television studios and on TV cameras all across the globe defending Israel and speaking against the terrorism that they've been facing is Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, who's been the former spokesperson, international spokesperson of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Jonathan Conricus, thank you very much for joining here on NDTV. Let me begin by asking you about this entire Gaza peace plan. You saw this unfold in front of your eyes, but are you hopeful that Hamas will really keep their end of the bargain?
Hello, and thank you for having me on. It's good to come back, and it's nice to be back under relatively positive circumstances for a change. Well, I wouldn't say that I'm hopeful. I'm a realist, and this is not my first rodeo, as the Americans say. I've been dealing with Hamas for a long time, and no, I don't expect Hamas to actually fulfill the agreement. And sadly, we can already see that they are, in fact, violating. You said correctly, all of the live hostages were returned yesterday, and that is a tremendous achievement. That's a strategic game changer. But Hamas was supposed to hand over 28 bodies of murdered Israeli hostages, and they failed to do so, returning only 4. That indicates that Hamas is going to try to play games and to prolong phase one and try to use the bodies as political leverage, which many of us in Israel anticipated. Now the question is, how will Israel respond? Will this mean that Israel decides that it is a very significant violation of the agreement and responds in kind? Or will we see military responses? There's definitely a lot of very angry and frustrated people in Israel, specifically the families of those murdered hostages, who demand exactly that.
Well, Jonathan, I completely agree. I've visited the hostage square in Tel Aviv. In fact, in the last 3 years, I've visited almost 3 times. And I remember just a year before 7th October 2023, I traveled with you all across the Gaza Strip near the southern Israel. And we visited a lot of kibbutz as well in that particular area. So I know how the common people in Israel have been suffering. But tell me something. If the hostages were alive and still out there in Gaza, wouldn't that have been a bigger leverage for the Hamas? And right now, it seems that the IDF and Israel have an upper hand, have an edge as compared to the Hamas.
Oh yeah, you're definitely correct. There is the fact that all of the live hostages have been returned and released is a game changer. It means that in terms of significant leverage over Israel, Hamas just forfeited its most important lever of pressure over Israel. And that is no small thing. And of course, for people, it's important for people to understand wherever this goes. It can go the peace way and it can go back to war. I would prefer the peace way, and I think most overwhelming majority of Israelis would prefer the peace way for the Trump plan to be implemented, for real significant long-term change to be effected in Gaza, for Gaza to be de-radicalized, and for Hamas to be forced to relinquish power. Those things would be great. And then a better and brighter future for everybody could be there. But if it doesn't go that way, and we go the war way, back to war, back to fighting, back to all of the horrible things that we've been forced to endure over the last 2 years, wherever we go, the fact that Hamas no longer has live Israeli hostages in their tunnels is a big deal. Because if Israel goes back to fighting, those tunnels, the Hamas tunnels, will become death traps. They will become places that Hamas fighters will not want to be in, because now Israel will be able to use totally different tactics if indeed we are forced to go back to fighting. And that is significant.
Well, I remember traveling to one of those tunnels that the Hamas had constructed near the Gaza border, and you were with me and I interviewed you inside that tunnel. But tell me something, also about the reconstruction plan. The Donald Trump-led peace plan for Gaza also says that there will be a reconstruction. There will be many international partners who will be a part of it, but there will also be a Saudi-led initiative, an international force perhaps that will take control of Gaza. Is that really plausible? Is that really practical? At a time when Hamas fighters or Hamas terrorists are very much still in control in some part of Gaza, and as we saw in the last few days, are again killing their own citizens.
Yeah. So very important point that you make, but the deal here, it is a staged deal where one stage is completed, and only when it is completed do we progress into the second stage. And that's important to understand, because first stage is return the hostages, live and dead. Second stage is for Hamas to be disarmed. Third stage is for Hamas to relinquish power over governing Gaza, and for an international interim government to be formed. Stage 4 cannot happen before stage 2, because it's pretty clear, and you know that very well, as India as a country that sends a lot of soldiers to UN peacekeeping and is a very important peacekeeping troop contributing country. You know very well that peacekeeping forces, whether they're UN, less useful, but non-UN as well, there's very little appetite for casualties and actual fighting. So I think that if you look at this from a clear-eyed perspective, I don't think that anybody believes that some magical regional international force will be formed and they will tidy up and take care of the trouble and actually stare down Hamas and force them to relinquish control over Gaza and then reign control and start administering. That is not realistic to believe. And I haven't seen any country actually prepare military forces for it, or I don't even know who that would be, because it's all very ambiguous. So the reality is that we see and understand Hamas, as you say correctly, acting as the thugs and brutal terrorists as they are now focusing their weapons on their brothers, Palestinians who they don't like, have issues with, are rivals, maybe have challenged them, and they're doing Palestinian type of justice. Swift justice system with public executions in street corners. That is what's happening now in Gaza. And the longer stage 1 happens, stage 1 being the return of hostages dead and alive, the longer time Hamas will have to do exactly this, to regain terror control over the population in Gaza, which I think is what they want. So it's a complex situation, and no, I don't think that anybody, in as much as I would like it, I don't think that anybody would do the heavy lifting for Israel. It'll have to be done by Israel, and then with support of Turkey and Qatar and Egypt, the transition may happen afterwards when it's already safe and not dangerous.
Well, Jonathan, since you mentioned India, I have to ask you this. Earlier this year, we had videos and photographs coming in from Pakistan, in fact, from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, where several Hamas leaders who traveled from different parts of Palestine or Qatar, and in fact met with UN designated terror groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed and others. Now we see Pakistan also part of this Islamic coalition that is helping and perhaps supporting this Gaza peace plan of Donald Trump. Is Pakistan really trustworthy at a time when, Hamas terrorists and Hamas leaders met Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed? These are the same people who did Mumbai 26/11 attacks, in which Hindus and Jews alike were killed. There were Americans who were killed in Mumbai. You would remember that. So how do you, from your perspective, see this?
I think you make a very fine point. And, when you look at the group photograph from Sharm el-Sheikh in Sinai, the people standing closest to President Trump are very bad leaders. There are countries that are state supporters of terrorism. You have Qatar, you have Turkey, and you have Egypt. These are countries that support terrorism. Maybe a little bit less Egypt, but Qatar and Turkey, they are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are active supporters of Hamas. From an Israeli perspective, just as bad as Pakistan is in an Israeli perspective, in an Indian perspective, sorry. So yes, and I know that Pakistan participated, but what President Trump is doing is, well, he's saying, well, I don't, I'm not going to look in your closet of skeletons and, ask you tough questions about your morality and where you stand. He says, I'm looking at you from a purely utilitarian point of view. Are you with me in this deal? Will you help me get this deal done? Yes, fine. You have a seat at the table. No, then you're not welcome. And I think there are many countries who are willing to do business like this, Pakistan being one of them. And I'm sad to see that they get this kind of recognition, and especially countries like Qatar and Turkey, who are not only paying lip service to
Right.
terrorist causes, but actually housing them, helping them, supporting them, funding them, real supporters of terrorism, just like Pakistan is in the sense of how they are supporting terror organizations that then murder civilians in India. So not a pretty picture, and I would rather have other countries there. But President Trump has shown us that his type of diplomacy is different. It is unorthodox, but so far it has delivered results where other types of diplomacy have not. So we'll give it the benefit of the doubt.
Also, last two questions. One thing that comes to my mind is that immediately after 7th October 2023, 2 years from now, we had a pledge taken by Mossad and IDF that we will go after the kingpins of both Hamas and Hezbollah, and we will completely, go after them. These are the perpetrators of the massacre that happened in southern Israel, and we saw that happen. But now that as part of this deal, a lot of these Hamas operatives have been released by Israel as well. Is your fear that these people could now, because they already radicalized, they could now revive Hamas in some ways, not just in Gaza, but perhaps in places like Qatar and Turkey as well?
Yes, that is the fear. That is what Hamas wants. That is what they demanded for the return of our 20 live hostages and 28 bodies. And they wanted even worse real terrorist leaders. Israel refused, but Hamas got 250 terrorists who were serving multiple life sentences, each and every one of them, for their active participation in planning and execution of the most heinous terror attacks in Israel, some of them killing more than 20 Israelis and other citizens. So yes, sadly, and this whole cycle of violence will continue. And I think Israel needs to do significant political and diplomatic and military adjustments to prevent the next hostage deal. And I think this is relevant for Indian legislators and security officials as well, because terrorists around the world, they see what Hamas did on October 7, that they took 251 Israelis hostage, and then they basically were able to dictate terms, even though militarily they're far weaker than Israel. But strategically, it was kind of a checkmate. And I fear that other terrorists, your enemies and other terror organizations, will see what Hamas have done and will try to emulate it. Therefore, what I believe needs to be done is to set into place legislative, diplomatic, legal, and military measures in order for it not to be such a profitable or lucrative business for terrorists to take hostages.
Right.
If we don't, terrorist organizations will take hostages again, and I fear other countries like India will face the same situation.
Well, Johnson, over the last 2 years, we've seen you often defend Israel in global studios from US to the Middle East and, of course, in India. And there's been a lot of propaganda that you had to, speak against, especially in the Western and the Middle Eastern press that has come in. Now, in the context of the Pahalgam terror attack, you must have heard that India suffered terrorism earlier this year in April in Pahalgam, in which 26 innocents were killed. And
Yes.
thereafter, there was a confrontation between India and Pakistan. There was a 4-day war and then a ceasefire. We have had to face a lot of propaganda as well. But now, India and Israel for last 25 to 30 years have had very great, robust diplomatic ties, and that has increased in the last 10 years. In fact, a few weeks back, when I met Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, he told me that the Israeli equipment functioned very well during Operation Sindoor by India against Pakistan. As someone who has worked very closely in IDF and has seen, India very closely as well, how would you want India and Israel strategic partnership now to grow?
I think there's great room to grow. And I watch your great nation and our little nation And I think that there's a lot of room to grow. I think we share the values of democracy and human rights, civil rights, and tolerance. We share great history and culture, diverse, but our nations are ancient and rely on ancient tradition and wisdom. And I think we face similar challenges. And even though India it's a continent and we are just a small country in Western Asia, I think there's mutually beneficial things that we can do, continue to do, to strengthen both our countries. And I think there's so much to do, not only in security. There's agriculture, there's medical tech, there's various other venues of industry that we can and we should explore more. And I'm happy to see the change in India when it comes to standing with Israel and taking a brave stand, sometimes changing real policy. And I think India has changed policy outwardly towards Israel. In the past, many years ago, sadly, India supported the other side. Today, I'm happy to see many times that India takes a different role, a positive, from my perspective, positive role, and I'm very happy for that. And I think very good things will happen to both of our countries as a result. I've traveled to India several times. I've met Indian peacekeepers on the Golan Heights. I've met them in UNIFIL. I have tremendous respect, and Israelis love India. And I think there's great room to grow. And I hope that we will do that. And not only because we face similar enemies that are fueled by hatred, by this perverted version of Islam, jihadist and extremist version of Islam, but also because we value the same things. And I think there's
Right.
great room to grow, and I look forward to it.
Well, certainly there's a great room to grow. The feeling is particularly mutual between India and Israel, and he's hoping that peace is given a chance and the end of hatred really happens. Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, for joining us here on NDTV.
Thank you.